Welcome to the Insight Meditation community of Charlottesville, Virginia. You can find all of our program offerings and information about our Sangha at www.imeditation.org. We meet weekly on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, currently on the Zoom platform for meditation and a Dharma talk given by one of our teachers. We also meet daily at noon Eastern Time on Zoom for sitting practice. We hope you can join us.
So one of the things we have begun doing is looking a bit at a ritual and ways in which we might just bring to mind something that we can do to remember or to consider as we, for example, begin a practice of meditation. So this has been done by several leaders before, but the lighting of a candle um, can be symbolic of many different things. And what I'd like to invite us tonight is just to remember and honor the ancestors, our ancestors who many, of course, we've never known, and those more immediate whom we have loved, but to whom we owe our lives, our precious lives. And to remember and honor those who've lived here on this land in Piedmont, Virginia, the Monacan Indians. And to the earth, planet Earth, to whom we owe our continued existence. May we remember all these with gratitude and with compassion. So I want to begin the talk this evening with a poem called Ancient Language. And the invitation right now is really just to sit back and close your eyes for a moment. Open your heart and just listen. Again, the poem is Ancient Language. If you stand at the edge of the forest and stare into it, every tree at the edge will blow a little extra oxygen toward you. It has been proven. Leaves have admitted it. The pines I have known have been especially candid. One said that all breath in this world is roped together, that breathing is the most ancient language. Ajahn Buddhadasa, who was a 20th century Thai monk, wrote that the entire cosmos is a cooperative. The sun, the moon, the stars live together as a cooperative. The same is true for humans, for animals, trees, and the earth. Even our bodily parts function as a cooperative. We realize that the world is a mutual, interdependent, cooperative enterprise, that human beings are all mutual friends in the processes of birth, suffering, old age, and death. And if our lives are not based on this truth, then we will all perish. So as humans alive in these bodies, we have three basic needs for survival and well-being. And one could be termed the need for safety, for survival. Another, the need for satisfaction. And then the third, the need for connection. For all sentient beings, including human beings, our only place for meeting these needs is our home, this small planet. And Joanna Macy, the Buddhist activist, says, basic to most spiritual traditions, as well as to the systems view of the world, is the recognition that we're not separate, isolated entities, but we're integral and organic parts of this vast web of life. And she goes on to say that we're a bit like neurons in a neural net through which flow currents of awareness of what's happening to us, both as a species and as a planet. So, in that context, the pain that we feel for our world is a living testimony to our interconnectedness with it. And she goes on to say, if we deny that pain, we become like blocked and atrophied neurons, deprived of life's flow and weakening the larger body in which we take being. But if we let it move through us, we can affirm our belonging. Our collective awareness increases. We can open to the pain of the world in confidence that it will neither shatter us nor isolate us, for we are not objects that break. We are resilient patterns within a vaster web of knowing. So the question posed tonight is, how do we respond to the pain of the world, to that vaster web of knowing, to climate concerns, to protecting this planet and all the beings who call Earth their home? And you can look at many spiritual traditions, and what we see is that compassion and love are offered as effective responses to that. And in the Buddha's teaching on compassion, which he describes as one of the four divine dwelling places, the Brahma Viharas, we see that compassion is essential for basic survival, and it's also essential for well-being. And it can begin at home in our hearts for ourselves, but that can be difficult at times because we're often or can be plagued by thoughts or feelings of self-doubt or shame or hatred or smallness. But ironically, when we discover that those thoughts aren't uniquely ours, that many, if not most humans, have the same kind of thoughts, sometimes we almost breathe a kind of audible sigh, and compassion for the self, for ourselves, becomes easier. There's something about just knowing that other humans have similar experiences to ourselves, that it's a fairly universal phenomenon that allows the heart to open, to relax, to release. And somehow the ego moves a little bit away from center stage, and we consider that it's possible to go beyond this small self. Sometimes we can sense a spiritual connection. We feel a sense of compassion, maybe the heart quivering in response to suffering, to the death of a loved one, the death of George Floyd, the death of a species on the planet. We also can feel the heart quivering with delight sometimes, a kind of pure delight, pure love, gazing into the eyes of a newborn baby, witnessing a beautiful sunset, hugging a friend. And sometimes we call these experiences sacred or an intuitive way of knowing or soul making. And however we name it, the experience, this experience of compassion, of love, of joy, can give rise to much goodness, to hope, to courage, to fierce determination. And what we see is that compassion actually supports our needs for all three: safety, satisfaction, and connection. Many of us have been engaged in reading and learning about the world in terms of climate concerns. And so this talk tonight is just a brief looking at what might be possible, and there's lots more to say about the topic. So what I thought I'd do is just suggest some contemplative practices that actually might help us or remind us how we can be grounded in compassion to help us hold the truths of climate change, the truth of species extinction, the ecological crisis in our hearts and minds. And the first of these practices is to find a grounding in ethics. So sometimes folks see climate concerns as an ecological issue or as a social one, but it's also an ethical issue. To some degree, it's happening because of what we have valued and how we have conceived of our identity as human beings on the planet, placing ourselves, for example, at the top of the hierarchy. If we can commit to extending ethics or sila to our relationship with the land, with water, with natural resources, animals, and humans, then non-harming, the ethic of non-harming, of gratitude, of simplicity, can all become points of reflection for change making. And if we can ground our conduct in ethical action and speech, then we can ground our activism or social engagement in wise compassion and love, wishing happiness for all beings. And when that happens, the activism becomes about what we're working for, not against. A second practice might be to become really comfortable with uncertainty, with impermanence. We don't know for certain what will happen as the earth warms. Evidence points to tipping points and crises that can't be averted. And we really don't have any idea of how much we can slow the suffering. In some sense, we're stepping into a void. And it's pretty common for us to want to know if our children and our grandchildren will be able to go to the shoreline or walk in the forest or breathe clean air, live in safety. It's human to fear that the world as we know it is changing. And it's possible that that level of uncertainty can feel deeply unsettling. So it's useful to remember that many of the Buddhist teachings focus on uncertainty, not as an inconvenience, but as a source of liberation. The Buddha taught that nothing is certain because nothing transcends impermanence, called a mark of existence, an undeniable truth of what it means to be alive. There's a good reason to embrace uncertainty with climate change as a liberating practice, because sometimes the more we fear uncertainty, the more likely we are to avoid thinking about climate change, for example. And in that case, our worst enemy might not be climate denial, but rather a kind of subtle, unconscious rejection of climate change based on our fear of the unknown. If we can embrace the truth of uncertainty, of impermanence, it's maybe possible to develop the courage to stay open, to stay engaged with the world. If we can accept the fragility of life on Earth, we can possibly invest ourselves in the possibility of collective action. A third practice might be to work with the multitude of emotions that can arise when we witness the destruction of ecosystems or mass extinction or climate injustices. All of those can provoke grief and sorrow. Sometimes when we encounter denial or apathy, we feel angry. Thinking about our children, their future, we experience trepidation and worry. And all of these are primal emotions, and they can be short term motivators when we're in immediate danger, but eventually they tend to result in stress and burnout. So, again, many spiritual traditions point to love and compassion as the motivators to drive effective and sustainable action. The question might be, well, how do you move from anger and grief to compassion and love? And one response might be to, instead of trying to get rid of those or erase them in some way, is to actually take that reactivity into a contemplative space. See if it's possible to liberate the energy of the emotion. Anger, for example, can be fixated on an object or a specific concern, and it can feel quite contracted and isolating, draining. But in a contemplative space, our focus on the object in the story, if we can turn inward to consider the emotion itself and our part in it, then anger might be a protective energy, a healthy response to that which threatens what we love. And that insight can liberate the contracted anger and move it to a wiser, more inclusive resolve to act with decisiveness and courage in the interest of love. So, in that contemplation, anger might become an inspiration for compassion, particularly if we recognize that this is how so many others feel. I'm not alone with this. We can redirect our attention from the story that has stimulated anger to compassion for ourselves and for all of us impacted by climate change. Another possibility might be to consider alternative ways of accessing wisdom. And what I mean by that is that climate change is usually talked about or written about in terms of the intellect. So there is a conceptual knowing of what's happening, why is it happening. And this is absolutely essential, but not sufficient. So yes, calculating your carbon footprint, taking a look at the One Earth Sangha website, reading books and articles about climate concern. These are all useful. And our response can grow more powerful and more resilient if we can access other ways of knowing as well, including body wisdom and non-conceptual wisdom. Susan spoke a little bit about this last week when she talked of accessing a non-dual mode of perception, because it's there that the illusion of separateness can fall away. There's a poem called clearing that points to this. It may be useful as we look at our own intentions to be with that which can feel overwhelming at times. This is what it says: do not try to save the whole world. Do not try to save the whole world or do anything grandiose. Instead, create a clearing in the dense forest of your life and wait there patiently. Wait there patiently until the song that is your life falls into your own cupped hands and you recognize and greet it. Only then will you know how to give yourself to this world. So it's here in this body that we can make our insights real and live them through actions of body, speech, and mind. And really, it's here on this earth that we take our place as human beings, rather marvelous animals who can respond and act, who can stand up for what's wholesome, who can say no when justice or respect for life is undermined. And it is us through love, humility, and compassion who have the capacity to let go of some physical comfort, convenience, let go of some psychological security for the benefit of the whole. And it's here on this earth, not someplace else, that we wake up. So I'll close with a short reflection and a final poem. In about an hour, it will be nightfall here in Virginia. It's been a beautiful, clear day, and we are midway between the new moon and the first quarter. So it might be a great night to go outside at nightfall and look for fireflies. And um, one of the things David and I have done is to go down to the little meadow behind our house and stand there in the darkness, surrounded by poplars, pines, oaks, maples, and witness thousands of firefly lights twinkling high up in the treetops and just above the grasses of the meadow. When it's completely dark, there's no discernible pattern. A patch of darkness may be lit by a single bright twinkling light, or maybe multiple firefly lights flash, brief brightness, silent, some so close you could touch them, others distant in silent space. The poem is Still Life at Dusk. It happens surprisingly fast, the way your shadow leaves you. All day you've been linked by the light, but now that darkness gathers, the world is in a great black tide. Your shadow joins the sea of all other shadows. If you stand here long enough, you too will forget your lines and merge with the tall grass and old trees, with the crows and the flooding river, all these pieces of the world that daylight has broken into objects of singular loneliness. It happens surprisingly fast, the drawing in of your shadow, and standing in the field. You become the field. And standing in the night, you are gathered by night. Invisible birds sing to the memory of light. But then, even those separate songs fade. Tiny drops of ink in an infinite spilling. So thank you for being here tonight for your practice.